He spent his whole life pretending to be someone he wasn't. Not in the way you'd think. Not a liar. Not a fraud in the criminal sense. He pretended, for 77 years, that his own name wasn't good enough. That Stanley Martin Lieber wasn't a name that belonged on the cover of anything important. So he invented someone else to do it for him. He called that someone Stan Lee. That invention would go on to co-create Spider-Man, the X-Men, Iron Man, Thor, the Hulk, the Fantastic Four, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, and half a dozen other characters who now anchor the most valuable entertainment franchise on the planet. By the time he died in 2018, at 95 years old, he had appeared in more box office hits than any actor in history. Presidents shook his hand. Kids across the world knew his catchphrase before they knew their own address. And yet, in his final years, a man who had spent his whole career telling stories about power and responsibility became the victim of exactly the kind of story he used to write, an old man surrounded by people who saw him not as a person, but as an asset to be drained. This is the rise and fall of Stan Lee. And the strange thing about this story is that the fall doesn't happen the way you expect. Stan Lee was born Stanley Martin Lieber in December of 1922 in a Manhattan apartment to Romanian Jewish immigrant parents. His father worked as a dress cutter, but the Great Depression hit the family hard, and work became sporadic. Stanley grew up sharing a bedroom with his younger brother, while his parents slept on a fold-out couch in the living room. Money was tight enough that as a teenager, he worked a rotating list of odd jobs just to help out writing obituaries for a news service. Delivering sandwiches to offices in Rockefeller Center, ushering at a Broadway theater, selling newspaper subscriptions door to door. What he actually wanted, though, was to write. Not comic books, the great American novel. He devoured books and movies growing up, especially anything with a hero in it. And he had big, sincere, literary ambitions for himself. So, when his uncle helped him land a job in 1939 at a small comic book outfit called Timely Comics, 17-year-old Stanley took it as exactly what it was, a temporary gig, a paycheck, nothing that should ever be associated with his real name. Comic books, at the time, had almost no social status. They were considered disposable junk for children. So, when he got his first writing credit on a Captain America story, he signed it Stan Lee, a play on his first name, specifically so that nobody would connect the embarrassment of comic books to the name he planned to put on serious literature one day. That single decision, made out of shame, would end up being the most successful piece of personal branding in the history of the comics industry. And it's worth sitting with, because it's the first thing you need to understand about this man. From day one, Stan Lee was a performance, a character, a more confident, more charming version of a kid who didn't think his own name was good enough. Yet, he rose fast, almost by accident. When the original editorial team walked out on the publisher in a dispute in late 1941, the boss needed somebody to fill the seat, even temporarily. Stan Lee was not yet 19 years old. He said, essentially, "Sure, I can do that," and then just never left. He would run Marvel's editorial side for the next 3 decades. The war interrupted things. Lee spent several years in the Army's Signal Corps, eventually landing in a training film division alongside people like Frank Capra and a young cartoonist named Theodore Geisel, the future Dr. Seuss. When he came back, he spent the better part of the 1950s writing whatever the market demanded: westerns, romance, horror, monster comics. By the end of the decade, he was tired of it. He'd been doing this for almost 20 years and had nothing close to the great American novel to show for it. He seriously considered quitting the industry altogether. And this is where the story turns. His wife told him something simple. If you're thinking about leaving anyway, why not write the kind of story you actually want to write first? You have nothing left to lose. So he did. And what came out of that permission is the second thing you need to understand about Stan Lee, the actual creative insight that built an empire. Up until that point, superheroes were flawless, perfect people in capes who never had a bad day. Lee's idea, working with the artist Jack Kirby, was to make superheroes flawed instead. Give them tempers. Give them bills they couldn't pay. Give them girlfriends they were bad at impressing. Insecurities, illness, vanity, pettiness. The Fantastic Four bickered like a real family because they basically were one. The Hulk was a monster because the man inside him was furious and had nowhere to put it. Peter Parker was an anxious teenager with money problems who happened to also fight crime. Readers had never seen anything like it, and they responded instantly. From 1961 onward, in an almost impossibly short window, Lee and a small group of artists, Kirby, Steve Ditko, Bill Everett, produced the Fantastic Four: the Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, the X-Men, Daredevil, Doctor Strange, and Spider-Man, all stitched together into one shared universe where characters crossed over into each other's stories. It was a creative explosion that redefined an entire medium in about 4 years. But building the characters was only half of what made Lee successful. The other half was building the relationship with the audience. And this is the third piece of the pattern. Lee understood, decades before anyone had a word for brand community, that people don't just want a product. They want to feel like they know the person behind it. He put credit panels on every story, naming the letterer and the inker, not just the star artist. He wrote a chatty, first-name column called Stan's Soapbox. He signed off with Excelsior. He wanted readers writing letters addressed Dear Stan and Jack instead of Dear Editor, and he got it. He turned the hobby into a fandom, and a fandom into a movement, at a time when comic publishers barely acknowledged their readers existed. There's a version of this story where that's the whole arc. Kid from a broke family invents a persona, invents an art form, becomes a legend. But there's a complication sitting underneath all of it, one that Lee's own collaborators pointed to for years: the question of who actually deserves the credit. Lee worked in what became known as the Marvel method. He'd sketch out a rough plot with an artist. The artist would draw the entire story, panel by panel, making most of the actual storytelling decisions. And only then would Lee come back in and write the dialogue. Jack Kirby, in particular, spent years arguing that he deserved co-creator status on nearly everything, not just Lee's collaborator. And because Lee was the one doing press, the one in front of cameras, the one whose face and name became inseparable from Marvel itself. He became the public author of a universe he didn't build alone. The Stan Lee persona wasn't just useful for hiding his own embarrassment about comics anymore. It had started quietly absorbing credit that other people had also earned. By 1972, Lee stopped writing monthly books entirely to become publisher, then eventually chairman. He'd built the empire. He'd become the face of it. And in the 1980s, he moved out to California to try to get Marvel's characters onto film and television. With mixed results, the technology and the studio appetite for superhero movies just weren't there yet. He kept a salary as chairman emeritus into the 1990s, $1 million a year, mostly as a figurehead. On paper, this is where a comfortable ending should live. Beloved industry legend, retired, cameo appearances, a happy final act. Instead, his later years become one of the strangest and saddest final chapters of any public figure's life. And this is the part of the story most people never hear. In 1998, Lee co-founded a company called Stan Lee Media, an early internet venture built around his name. It went public through a reverse merger and grew to over 150 employees. Then, in line 19, investigators discovered illegal stock manipulation by Lee's business partner and another executive. The company collapsed into bankruptcy in 2001. Lee himself was never implicated in the fraud, but the pattern had already been set. His name, his likeness, the Stan Lee persona he'd spent 60 years building, had become a financial asset that other people were willing to gamble with, legally or otherwise, whether or not he was in the room. In 2002, Lee actually sued Marvel, the company he'd spent his life building, because he wasn't being paid his promised share of profits from the X-Men and Spider-Man films that were suddenly making the company enormous money. He'd created some of the most valuable intellectual property in modern entertainment as an employee, which, under the law, meant he never owned it. The case settled in 2005 for an undisclosed sum. Around the same period, he founded POW Entertainment to keep developing new projects. But that company would also go public through a reverse merger, and years later, it would be sold to a Chinese conglomerate, without, Lee claimed, ever properly telling him. That deal happened in 2017, the same year Lee's wife of 69 years, Joan, died after a stroke, and the same period his own eyesight was failing badly. According to Lee, executives at his own company presented him with a contract they described as a simple, non-exclusive license to use his name and likeness. He signed it. It turned out to be exclusive. He filed a $1 billion lawsuit over it in 2018, and then dropped it a few months later, in circumstances that remain murky, issuing a confused public statement about wanting to move forward with the people he'd just sued. That same year, allegations surfaced that Lee had sexually harassed nurses caring for him at home. He denied it and said the accusers were trying to extort him. Separately, and far more clearly documented, reporting emerged that Lee had become the target of what multiple outlets described as elder abuse. A man named Kia Morgan, who had positioned himself as Lee's business manager and a memorabilia collector, was accused of isolating the aging, grieving, half-blind Lee from his own daughter and lifelong friends in order to control access to an estimated $50 million in assets. A restraining order was eventually issued against Morgan, and he was criminally charged with false imprisonment, elder abuse, fraud, and grand theft. Another manager, brought into Lee's life by his own daughter after Jones' death, allegedly used a power of attorney to fire Lee's personal banker, rewrite his will, and move millions of dollars out of his accounts. Lee, in a lawsuit of his own, called the people circling him in that period unscrupulous businessmen, sycophants, and opportunists. Stan Lee died on November 12, 2018, from cardiac arrest, months after his final public battles over his own name and money had barely settled. His last words, spoken to his longtime friend and successor Roy Thomas, were, "God bless. Take care of my boy, Roy," a line so ambiguous that fans immediately speculated he meant Spider-Man. He probably meant Roy Thomas himself, whom Lee had nicknamed decades earlier, in the same joking spirit he used for his own persona, Stan the Man Lee, Roy the Boy Thomas. There's a real irony sitting at the center of this story, and it's not the one people usually reach for. It's not really that a man who wrote about power and responsibility for a living got taken advantage of. That's almost too neat. The real irony is this. Stan Lee spent his entire life building a version of himself designed to be lovable, marketable, and endlessly useful to everyone around him to marvel, to fans, to business partners, to his own company. That persona made him one of the most recognizable names on earth. But it also made him something else, an asset, a brand that other people, again and again, across 6 decades, tried to own, license, sell, and eventually exploit, sometimes legally and sometimes not. The kid who was too embarrassed to put his real name on his own work ended up building a fictional identity so valuable that, in the end, almost everyone around him had a financial interest in it except him. He gave the world Spider-Man's line about power and responsibility. It's worth asking whether anyone in his own life, at the very end, actually lived by it